Hello, and good to talk to you again. And I'm preaching from the Gospels from Matthew, and I'm quite intrigued by what happened in the early part of the ministry of Jesus. Because here, if you read in Matthew chapter 8, and really, Jesus is saying something a little bit unusual here in that when he was come down from the mountain, and you notice that Jesus spent a lot of time on the mountain in communication with his Father. I find it quite interesting, the involvement in the Bible in mountains, because even in the Old Testament, God appeared to Moses on Mount Sinai. Elijah saw the miracles on Mount Carmel. And even today, I find great comfort and great help when I go to the mountains to pray. And God answers. That's the interesting thing. So here in the beginning of Matthew chapter 8, when Jesus was come down from the mountain, a great multitude followed him. And it's quite interesting because, yes, when Jesus was teaching, he was followed by large crowds, multitudes. But it's quite clear that much of the following was to do with his miracles, because actually from here in chapter 8, you see a vast number of miracles happening, because he came down from the mountain and a leper came and worshipped him, saying, "Lord, if you want to, you can make me clean, heal this leprosy," because as you know, leprosy basically was in those days was incurable. And in verse 3 it says, Jesus put out his hand and touched him and said, "I will be clean." And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. But here in verse 4, you see something quite interesting, because Jesus then said to this man, "Don't tell anyone. Go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded." But this was simply because under Jewish law, it was the priest who had to confirm that he was healed. And lepers were outcasts. They weren't allowed to mix. And this is why the importance of healing to this man. And you know, one of the interesting things to me about this is the way that Jesus so often healed and cleansed, and the word used in the authorized, and I'm speaking from the King James Version, so often the description used in the King James Version is not healing, it's cleansing. Because this was a different kind of sickness, leprosy, and they had to be cleansed. And so the command was not to tell anybody except the priest, but that when he went to the priest, if you actually interpret verse 4, he's saying two things. Jesus is saying, don't tell anyone about this miracle, but go to the priest, offer the gift that was commanded by Moses, and that this will be a testimony to them. So in actual fact, the testimony, interestingly here, was not to the people, but to the priests in the temple. And I find this quite interesting. I've not really been quite so conscious of what this means before. But here, you see, it was eventually to be the priests that condemned Jesus. You know that it was the priests who punished him, who beat him, and conspired to his death. I mean, we all know that when Jesus was arrested, he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane by the priestly guards. It wasn't Romans, it was the Jewish priests. And the interesting thing is that was illegal under temple law. In fact, reading a book that was proving the resurrection, one of the issues was that the arrest of Jesus was illegal because it was illegal for the temple guard to be used to arrest someone on a charge of this nature. So it wasn't the Romans, it was the Jewish priests. And here, you see, even as early as Matthew chapter 8, what Jesus is doing is he's saying, don't tell the people, because of course he's come down from the multitudes, and I'm assuming that what he was referring to was, don't tell the multitudes following me. It's quite interesting. He says, don't tell them, but start off by the official, which was to prove the evidence that he was cleansed, and then to make this as a testimony at the witness to the priest. Now, what I'm seeing here is the big contrast between the multitudes following him and the Orthodox priests. And then if you move to the next verse, you see verse 5, Jesus then entered into Capernaum, and there came to a centurion beseeching him. So now you're dealing with a totally different aspect. We've dealt here with the ordinary Jewish people following him. We've dealt with the man cleansed of the leprosy going to the priests. And now by verse 5, Jesus has entered into Capernaum, and there came to him a centurion, Roman centurion. So this is quite interesting because although Jesus came to his own, and the scripture is absolutely clear, the ministry of Jesus was to his people, the Jewish people, and yes, to the scribes and the Pharisees, and those in the temple. But here, I'm finding this quite intriguing because, you know, that the accusation against Peter and Paul was that they were preaching to the Gentiles. But Peter couldn't preach to the Gentiles until he had the vision of the sheet let down from heaven with the unclean animals. And so it was only at that point that the gospel was reaching then to the Gentiles. This Roman priest is a Gentile. He's not a Jew. So the centurion comes to him and said, Lord, my servant is at home sick of the palsy and grievously tormented. And Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. And the centurion in verse 8 says, Lord, I'm not worthy that you should come to my roof. And you know, to me, this is one of the most amazing miracles, because the Roman centurion, because he's not a Jew, and because he's part of the occupying army, you've got to understand that Jerusalem at that time was not free. They'd come out of domination and control by the Greeks. The Greeks were thrown out by the Romans. Now they were under Roman domination. You have to understand that the whole of the New Testament is based on a time when the Romans controlled Jerusalem and in effect controlled Israel. And so this is one of the rulers, one of the hated Romans who has come. And so he can quite justifiably say, I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof, but speak the word only, and my servant will be healed.